much. Okay, with that, and with respect absolutely to our two wonderful panelists and for their time tonight, we're going to get started. And before we start the introductions with them, let me just introduce myself. My name is Brad Karcher, and I'm one of the co-organizers of the Hacking HR Indianapolis chapter. Our chapter has been in operation for a little bit more than a year. There may be some of you, I believe, that have attended some of our previous events. Those events have taken place in person, and then most recently, of course, they've been conducted virtually. We try to put on events about once a quarter. That's kind of what our target is. We try to have a variety of different types of topics, and I'll talk about what those topics have looked like in the past. But for those of you who may not be as familiar with Hacking HR, it's really a community of individuals who come from different walks of life from an HR and from a business perspective. And it's people who embrace the notion of challenging the future of work and how technology potentially plays a role in scripting that and making an impact back to an organization. And for those of you who aren't aware, there are several chapters throughout the world, actually. There are about 82 chapters that are live today. And so as you can see, we are spread out in lots of parts of the globe, including Indianapolis, which is kind of buried down in here. Chicago has a chapter too, and they're quite active. So you're not limited, of course, to just participating in whatever the local chapter is. And in particular, because many of those are being done virtually, I invite you to take advantage of different chapters and what they may be presenting on. And you may or may not be aware, but there's actually an annual conference that Hacking HR puts on. And there's some information in front of you here about the conference coming up in March. It's actually a multi-day conference. It talks in terms of HR innovation and the future of work. And as you look at the numbers that are in front of you, those are real. We put this conference on before, 500 presenters, 100 different sessions, and as you can see, thousands of participants, and quite a high level of participants that come into the event itself. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to go to Hacking HR. Just do a Google search for that, and that will pop up, and you can explore that and take a look at registering for that particular event. But tonight, we've got an event that's going to focus in on a really critical topic that is so relevant in not only our work lives, but our personal lives. And it's the notion of diversity and inclusion. And we're quite thankful and fortunate to have a couple of really great leaders in the diversity and inclusion space here in the local Indianapolis marketplace. And I'm going to turn this over in just a moment to Devin Michael, who's going to handle the moderator responsibilities for our time together this evening. And before I turn that over, Devin, so you can get everybody properly introduced, let me just make the attendees aware that if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A section of the Zoom conference. As we get closer to the tail end of our time together, we'll do our best to raise those questions to our two panelists. So with that, Devin, I'm going to let you turn this over and get our two guests introduced.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Brad. Again, my name is Devin Michael, one of the co-organizers here, and super proud to be able to do my first moderating on this topic with these two ladies. They're brilliant stars in diversity and inclusion, and we're super proud to have them here. So I don't want to steal their thunder. This is about them, but Lisa and Tracy both have served in their own right as served and currently serving as Chief Diversity Officers. Lisa at IU Health and Tracy at Anthem, and now she's turned coaching and consulting. And so I will let them do their quick elevator pitch, but just wanted to give a quick intro. So Tracy, if you want to go ahead and fill any gaps that I missed.
Yeah, thanks, Devin. And nice name. My daughter's name is Devin, so I'm loving the name. I am so excited to be here with you all this evening, along with Lisa. Lisa and I know each other from a past life, and I'm sure we'll have much to say about this topic, because being a CDO is probably one of the toughest jobs out there, but probably one that we both love the most. And to that end, I would say I took that passion and that love that I had for that role. And after I left Anthem and thought I was going to retire, I couldn't step away from the things I love, which are diversity and inclusion and coaching. So I do that in my consulting organization now.
Awesome. Lisa?
So Lisa Gutierrez, I have, my passion is connecting the dots between amazing people, their backgrounds, and solving complex problems. And I've now done it. This is my 7th grade organization at IU Health. I started it with Procter & Gamble, and I've now done it in 9 industries. So I love figuring that out, and I love building D&I into the rhythm of the business of the organizations, and all those organizations I've worked in. One was a university, another university, but I worked in consumer products. I've worked in supply chain. It's always a little bit different. So like Tracy, we both have a passion for complexity and solving big problems, and diversity and inclusion to do so. So
Awesome.
Be here.
Yeah, I'll make a quick note before we jump in. The one thing I can say about both of you is that you're not doing diversity for the sake of calling it diversity. You really are both passionate about it, and that shows through speaking. So that's why I'm super excited to be here with you guys and for everyone that's attending. So let's jump in. So the title of this event is taking a counterintuitive approach, and that's going to be what we talk about most. But before we jump into that, what are some of the approaches that you guys are seeing in D&I strategy that maybe just aren't going in the right direction? And we'll start with you, Tracy.
You know, the thing that I would say is, this environment right now that we're in, after seeing in a very visible way 8 minutes, 46 seconds of George Floyd losing his life, caused a lot of organizations to have what they might call their aha moment and their wake-up call to the D&I conversation. What's interesting, though, is that many of them jumped into that in a very visible way, but not in a way that was really tied to their business. So, we're going to talk later about kind of that counterintuitive approach to do it. But what I am seeing as I work with organizations is visibility became the number one opportunity. So you immediately saw organizations who were making very visible and large donations to organizations to fight social and racial injustice. What I also see a lot of is people grabbing for the very visible, low-hanging fruit. So what you may see is organizations forming resource groups. Resource groups have been around forever. So now many companies who weren't in the game are like, I'm in, let's get some groups together. In fact, I'm consulting with an organization who they think that's their one task is we'll create resource groups and we will address the diversity problem. So what I would say is that some of the more traditional approaches and some of the more reactionary approaches are things that don't get to the root of any business issue. They really are things that are intended to be very visible. They're the things that we can see, but they don't unpack a business problem. They don't unpack process change. They don't unpack culture change.
Gotcha. Lisa, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think Tracy hit on it, but I would say siloed conversations. So a traditional approach is siloed conversations. You saw it back in the late 90s. Let's focus on women. Let's focus on women. You saw millennials. Let's go focus on millennials, but nobody would talk about what was going on with Gen Xers and boomers or anything else. So traditional is really siloing the conversation and saying, let's go work on that thing. Training, lots of traditional stuff about let's just go with training. And I agree with Tracy. It may look like the low-hanging fruit, but it's a doer thing. Like people just want to do something. So everybody's done unconscious bias training, and now they're realizing, and the research shows it really doesn't shift behavior. It causes awareness, but doesn't always shift behavior. So training, ERG, she hit on that. I would hit on the piece, I think, heart-based. A lot of fill your heart, do D&I for the heart-based reasons versus the business. And so there's always a disconnect in my day job. How does that thing help my day job? And I think that's part of the hack that Tracy and I have been on a journey with, is really thinking about it beyond that. And then the last traditional thing I've seen a lot, and I'm going to use my metaphor, but a lot of focus on activities, on buying. I'm going to use this because I'm Latina, but I remember I never went to an organization for chips and salsa. And yet we would spend a lot of time talking about what are we going to do for Hispanic Heritage Month? And people would talk about, let's just do chips and salsa. I mean, sometimes literally.
Mhm.
So I think I've always focused on, let's focus on the marriage, not the wedding. And a lot of the diversity stuff is focused on the wedding. You know, what color napkins, you know, what are you going to do? What's it going to look like? Not really behind the scenes is it going to be sustainable beyond this day or this event? So I think some traditional things, and to Tracy's point, they might look like low-hanging fruit, but to some people, they might be lots of work. And then
Mhm.
you look up and you say, did we move the needle that we wanted to move?
You know, and I would add to that, that I think she hit a great point, that there is this kind of selection of well-intentioned versus intentionality.
Yeah.
So that in the moment, let's do something well-intentioned, like she said, to the heart. But the intentionality of what that means to the business isn't always thought out, isn't always dug into. And so we miss real opportunities around meaningful work. And it's easy to put your arms around action planning. That's where people go because, like she said, they want to do something. And so they get caught up in the doing. To what end is what we have to ask. What is the intention of the doing?
Gotcha. A follow-up question on that. Would you say that taking these approaches that are quote unquote wrong approaches is damaging? Or would you just say it doesn't do anything for
No,
progress?
I think, Devin, I'll just say, I don't think they're wrong approaches. I just think it's that intentionality. It's thinking, the question I always ask is, what's the end game? You know,
Mhm.
high five, like what, do I want to win a Super Bowl or do I just want to play a football game, right? What am I trying to do? And so it's not a wrong approach because employee resource groups, the outcome that you get from them is engagement, and it can actually deliver retention. But they aren't always going to deliver promotions up, you know, this kind of stuff. So it's really, it's being more intentional and matchmaking the problem with potential solutions. And it could be that in somebody's journey, in one organization I worked on, that was such a huge thing because the employees' voices were so silent that being a place for a collective voice for people to share something was a relief. They were like, measure though that I put into that was an engagement measure. Okay. So it was just like, yes, that's what they needed. And that their voices were launched and that's what they needed. So I wouldn't say it's wrong. I think it's at what point in the journey and what problem are you trying to solve?
But you know what I would add to that, Devin, is that it's not wrong, but to Lisa's point of how you connect the problem up with the solution and what you measure is really critical. Because right now, I find that, especially with minorities, especially the African-American community, the BS radar is on high alert. And so when you are jumping into activities, AKA some of those organizations who wrote the big checks, but they failed to address the lack of promotions and succession planning and pipeline for African-American leaders, some of that was really upsetting to people. So hearing that kind of feedback. So it's not that people are getting it wrong. It's to Lisa's point. What problem or game are you trying to play?
Yeah.
What are you really trying to solve for? And make sure you're not tone deaf to your associates within your organization, because you may be playing a game and that's not the game, that's the problem.
Gotcha. You need to be careful about not putting the wrong solution to the problem you're trying to.
Yes, like Lisa said, connecting the right two components, problem with the right solution and the right measure.
Got it. Okay. Okay, so on a flipping the script now, we're going to talk about the counterintuitive approach that you guys both are accustomed to. What are some of the foundational activities or thoughts that you have about that approach to D&I? And we'll start with Lisa.
I think, so Devin, when we first met, I think you asked me a question of, and I still use this, was what do you kind of rely on? And I started thinking about this. I rely in this work, this passion, I run my business more than anything else, because the cultural brain, I rely on that too, but I've now done this work in 60 countries, right? Or for 60 countries. You can't know everything about everything. So the business brain of it is, I think the counterintuitive or the foundational is learning the business of your business. Done it now in 9 industries. The way the way I worked, I was at Cummins. So Cummins was engineering. The rhythm of that business was a Six Sigma rhythm. That's a little bit different from, I'm at IU Health now, which is delivering services and our promise to patients and their families. It's a little bit different, right? And so I think understanding how the business happens, and what I see a lot of times is people go into a job and they say, I'm going to do it, but they don't always understand the full 360 aspect of, here's what my boss is worried about, here's how budgets really happen, here's the problem that they are trying to solve. Can I help solve some of that? So foundational premise for me on this counterintuitive thing is actually start with some of the head, not all of it, but start with your head, start with the business part, and then start looking for intersections of where to weave in diversity and inclusion, ideas, solutions, hacks, whatever. What we did in the past, Tracy and I, what we did in the past as young practitioners is we focused just on the diversity thing, and we tried to make the diversity thing onto the business. And then what people might say is like, I don't have time. At IU Health, the number one barrier is people are exhausted and they're saving lives. So you can't say, well, go do my diversity training and don't save a life. You know,
Right.
you have to be right. You have to really be critical and strategic about that. That's not cool. So I sit there and think, okay, that's really the business of it. Now, that wasn't what we, at Procter & Gamble, we weren't trying to save a life. We were trying to sell you some coffee and some soap, right? But we knew it would make your life better. Now, we know that with the toilet paper thing at COVID-19, they were perfectly fine. So it's what is important. So I think it's that foundational thing is learn the business of the business and learn the business of what your leaders and your organization is thinking about, worrying about first.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly, and I can give you a perfect example of that. You know, when I was at Anthem, we had a number of resource groups, and one of the greatest challenges was trying to get traction for those resource groups, not just in terms of what they were doing culturally, bringing speakers in, driving a level of engagement, but each of our resource groups had to be chartered around the business. And so we were always kind of out there beating the drum of how can we get engaged in the business. Well, when we found a perfect opportunity with the ACA, we realized that the market that we really had to tap into was the Latino market. We had a resource group who could break that down in spades and really tell us what the challenges are in reaching that marketplace. And when we married up our resource group Somos with that work, all the resource groups took off because we started to see how diversity can drive the business. But when we were sitting over on the side as these groups who brought the chips and salsa, you know, and had these moments, that didn't work. But once we were able to align the business with the work of D&I and help them solve a business problem through a different lens, that made all the difference, catapulted the credibility of all the resource groups.
Great story.
So do you feel like when, we'll say that, we'll coin the term getting into the rhythm of the business. So when you do that successfully, do you feel like your team or your business unit becomes more respected, more listened to, more valued, more needed in the company?
You know what? Absolutely. I mean, if Lisa and I talk about our backgrounds, we might not look like we were D&I practitioners, if you will. I came out of operations. Yep. I was almost 20 years in running the insurance business.
I came out of sales.
Yeah. And when I went into HR, I didn't go into D&I. I did everything in HR except for benefits and rewards. That's probably the only thing I didn't do is compensation. And so my background, when I sit across from a leader and I talk about what their business challenges are, and I think Lisa probably approaches it the same way. Let's talk about the business. Let's talk about what you're struggling with. Then we can start to unpack the connection to diversity and inclusion. So it isn't about me coming in and saying, oh, I'm the CDO and, you know, thou shalt respect diversity and everyone shall be included. It doesn't work that way. This is about business.
Right.
So I'll give a similar, for me, the rhythm of the business, I'll take this example. I was the diversity leader for Los Alamos National Laboratory, which is run by University of California. I was hired to fix racial profiling allegations. It was a mess. That was in the year about 1999, 2000, and we worked together. The drama, the real cultural issue there was between PhDs, scientists, and non-scientists.
Mhm.
It was actually the overarching issue, and it was more prevalent than racial, ethnic, gender, anything else. So by focusing on that, and this is the part about that rhythm of the business, when you start learning that and you start realizing I don't have a PhD, and they're dismissive of anybody that didn't have a PhD. I was dealing with 5,000 scientists that would either number 1, 2, or 3 in the world. This is the place where Albert Einstein also did some of his research, right? So you have that kind of a culture, and then you're coming in with a business degree, and I have business information about diversity. They just did not buy it. They trusted research, and they put what's the, how do you know what you know? I found a fluid dynamics physicist that was doing, for the fun of it, research in the science of diversity to prove through mathematical modeling and simulation that a diverse group of bees, ants, or people would solve problems better. This guy's research became the basis for my strategies, and more done with that and moving that through because they trusted it. It was their language of research. I built in some other stuff that worked for technicians and worked for people that were not PhDs, but that's that rhythm. If I had continued pushing on the business books, and here's what the business people say, and they were just dismissive of it. I also required my team. I had technical talks. I mean, I think I was the dumbest person in those rooms, right? They would ask me and I'd be like, I have no idea what you just said. I think I got 50%, but I learned how they joked. I learned what was important to them. I learned what irritated them. And I started building that in. And when you start, like Tracy's talking about, when you start understanding that and you build that, you're predicting some of it, you're building it into your strategies. You're thinking about here, they might say no here, they might say yes here. Then I was getting more yeses because I'm building that in. Sometimes as practitioners, we wait, we're so worried about getting the yes that we don't plan for when they get the yes, and then we're ready to rock and roll with something that will work. So I think it's exactly that. It's fun. It's just fun this way. And you end up, a measure for me, Devin, is how many people, when you do that, are coming towards you, not avoiding the D&I.
Exactly.
And my D&I, my department at IU Health, we have a waiting list of internal clients that are saying, help us with this, help us with that, not, oh, I don't want to talk to them, right? And I think that's a measure of, it's like net promoter scores. Do your customers recommend you to other people?
And I think Lisa really brings up a great point too around understanding the culture of an organization. So she talked about, spending time, learning how they joke, learning what really drives decision-making. They respect data, becoming really deep in what they are talking about and their issues. I always would tell my team, you can't outpace the culture of the organization. You want to drive it, but you have got to meet them where they are. And so whatever that dialogue is, understanding what the leaders in that organization are concerned about, and what they're dealing with every day, and how to make what you're trying to drive fit into how they're executing on a daily basis. That's really critical. So you have to do that work too, not just the head work of, here's what the business is trying to get done, but knowing how that culture flows and how it executes.
Yeah.
That seems like a really good starting point for people that are maybe new to D&I, like start by just taking inventory of where you are and what you're dealing with first.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the thing is you start with your strength, right? Many people think in this work that you need to know lots of stuff, but I think if you realize that you already do know, like Tracy, she knew her operations, sales, you find a language that's your strength, and then you can bounce off of that to then start integrating in diversity and inclusion ideas or inclusive leadership into how you do what you're strong at.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Awesome. Tracy, you talk about data as like you're a huge proponent of data and your storytelling for D&I to move conversations forward. Could you talk about maybe some real life examples of how you use data or how you approach, your storytelling or your conversations with leadership?
Well, I like to remind people that you can't solve a problem that you can't define. So Lisa brought this up too. She said, hey, there's lots of things people are doing, but what game are we playing? What solution? And how are we measuring the results? So it's really critical. You cannot solve a problem that you cannot define. You may solve many things, but you will not know if you've solved your problem. And so continuing that perspective of a business mindset, when you bring that into the DEI conversation, you have to be able to measure results. So like Lisa said, if we're trying to give this resource group a voice, then we need to be measuring some metrics around engagement that demonstrate that that's showing up. So it's the same way. If I'm going to talk to a leader about their succession plan and what they're trying to execute in the big realm of their overall strategic plan, then I need to measure how talent is moving through their organization so I can demonstrate that. One of the great examples that I'm really proud of at Anthem, and I know Jessica Aguilar is on this call and she can attest to this, but we use data to really define where we had ceilings for minority talent. So we looked at how talent moved through our organization, how we hired it, how it got promoted, how it exited the company. And we found in certain parts of our business that were critical to the strategy. So we went back to the strategy and we said, what are we trying to accomplish? What are the areas of the organization that we really need to focus on, like our provider piece of the business? That was one of our areas we really needed to focus on. We looked at where the ceilings were, and we discovered that we did not have minority talent that was making it to higher levels in our commercial business and in the provider realm. We developed a program for leadership development, and we focused only on minority talent, and we focused on the pipeline for those parts of the business that needed those areas of focus. So we started with the strategy, we backed it up to the business problem, we identified the metric that told us where the problem was, and we tapped into talent development in that area. That was a hard conversation to have with the organization, to say, hey, we're only going to focus on the development of minority talent. It was hard to just hear those words because it sounds exclusive, but when you unpack the data behind that, the business case was loud and clear. Straight ahead, we did that for like 4 years, and we hit the dial, and we actually saw promotions and expansion of roles for minority talent during those program years.
I'll add to this. I totally agree with Tracy on a lot of that. One of the challenges I've had by moving different industries, different companies, is that not every organization has a history or has the quality of data that you need to make these hard-based data decisions. Okay, so you're kind of being intuitive in some situations. And I go back to Albert Einstein said, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. Okay.
Great point.
The other thing is recognizing that data or patterns or information is going to come in different ways. There might be some hard numbers, but Daniel Goleman calls it the chatter of an organization, right? The grumbles in an organization. It's assessing that. In one organization doing the engagement survey, for example, we had 6% of the people that refused to participate in the engagement survey. So we had a 40% completion. So you actually had more people whose voices were silent and weren't using that tool. So I actually had some really amazing people. I said, go play with that. Figure out how we measure silence. How do you measure silence? And what does that mean? And they were just like, oh my gosh. And there's other ways of getting information, right? It's stuff like that. So I think I agree with Tracy, but I've been in organizations where I'm working actually now at IU Health on a project right now. And I'm just like one of my colleagues, she calls it the source of truth. The source of truth is only as valid for about 4 years. So I'm telling everybody, relax on the other years. Let's just focus on those 4 and see what we can learn.
Yeah,
great point.
That kind of plays well into this next question for you, Lisa. And this is something when we first did our introduction talk, you mentioned love is the hack. And so love is not something, well, you can measure it. My wife's not watching, but you can measure it. But love is not something you can quantifiably measure with data. And so what is your thought when you say love is the hack? What are some stories that you've encountered where love was the answer to, progress?
I love that question. It's the strangest thing. So I've got to share with everybody a little bit of a story. As a younger practitioner in this area. I came in from sales. I went into, I was a practitioner in D&I through the sales organization before I even got into HR. But we had a bunch of beliefs. And one of those beliefs, Devin, was, they just don't get it. Who's the they, right? We were gender stuff with women, but we were like, the men just don't get it, right? And we would almost like we would be in a women's group and we would all confirmation bias that the men didn't get it, but then we would invite men into the conversation, right? We started doing that. And this is where it hit me the first time, because I was bringing a group of people together and we were going to talk about gender strategies. And at this point, we had all the data, we had everything, we had the business case. But I had a lot of the men that I had been in sales with, and I had been the only woman for a long time in certain departments. And these men came to me behind the scenes, and these were the men that had trained me, that had developed me, that had recruited me, that helped promote me. And behind the scenes, they were like, Lisa, I'm not sure I want to come because I think I'm going to get bashed. I think I'm going to, I'm just kind of hurt, really, hurt. I developed you, I promoted this. So what I ended up doing was actually creating a brand new exercise that kind of said, who do you develop? Who do you mentor? Let's identify those. And then who mentors you? By the time we were done, almost all the women in the room had identified a man that had helped them develop. And the aha for me, and I didn't get to use the word love at those points because we were talking numbers. Health. It's about love. You have to, I sat back and I thought, I have men in my life. I have my brothers, my dad, boyfriends, all this stuff that I loved. And I thought, what would happen if we start approaching people like that? I have women in my life, Black women in my life, I have Asian women in my life. What would happen if I looked at it with love? And it doesn't mean you have to like everything, but with love, and then says, what does that mean? And most people, when they manifest some sort of love, whatever it is to them, they are more kind, they're curious, they want to help. And so for me, that became the hack. So when we start talking about all this, sometimes it's HR topics or all this, whatever the topic that's going on with D&I, I'm stepping back. And that means like at IU Health, I love our physicians. I love our nurses. I love our environmental service workers who people say they clean, they pick up trash, but they're actually reducing hospital acquired infections, and they're doing it with joy. And they did it amidst a pandemic, a global pandemic that nobody knew, but they were strapping on everything. That takes love. And when you do them, there was one of our environmental service workers, and she said that every time she was going in, and she was one of the few people that they could see, she was praying for the patients and saying, I hope that you'll get to see your family. I hope this. And so I think, I don't know. So I've been hacking that. So a big hack for me is to actually say it, just say in a business setting, we're going for love. And kindness and passion. And it's just fascinating to me that that's a language that translates across differences. It translates in countries, people can feel it. They can feel when you love their country or their culture with curiosity and kindness. They can feel when you don't, right? You're complaining. When I was in India, and I'll close out with this story, a lot of Americans would go to India with the companies I was in, and they would always complain. They'd complain about stuff. And I've been there for about 2 or 3 weeks. And some of the people from India, they said, you haven't complained. You haven't complained once. And I'm like, wow. They go, usually they're complaining about the food. They're complaining about this. And they said, why aren't you complaining? I go, because I love it. I love the messiness. I love the fact that we're in traffic and there's these mopeds and there's cars and there's an elephant and nobody's gotten in an accident. I mean, nobody got in an accident. And we're so organized in the US and we get in car accidents all the time. I'm fascinated with it. I'm just fascinated. And I said, that messiness is what causes innovation. So I'm fascinated with that. And just that kind of love, they're just like, they started beaming and they're just like, you see that? Not, oh, I see all the, I see that you don't have the burger that I want, that kind of stuff. So I think I don't know, that's the hack I've been playing with for a while.
I think that's incredibly powerful because when I think about the environment we're in right now, we've got labels for everything. We've got Democrats, we've got Republicans, we've got protesters and allies and supporters and left and right. there's so many ways that we label it. But at the end of the day, I think right now, especially in this moment, diversity comes down to humankind and to love. And a perfect example of that, to add on to what Lisa just shared, I'm working with a client now who operates in the government affairs space. And so politics all day long. Can't wait for this election to be over. And the leader came to me for support in executing a D&I strategy. And as I did some interviews to get some feedback around where their opportunities of focus were, one of the consistent themes was that that leader was like their biggest asset. And she was an unlikely leader. So she's white, she's female, she's Republican. And if I dare say my words and not others, probably a Trump supporter. And no one expected her to care about this topic. And here's why she cares. She loves the work that she does. She loves the people that she worked with. And one of the African-American women said to her that she did not feel included. And it broke her heart.
Yeah.
And so that is her passion for why to make this change. It doesn't matter what box she checks, what label she's got on. Diversity is about humankind. It's about love and the opportunity to make a difference. And that's what's driving this woman. And she is getting high praise from across that organization for that.
Yeah.
So now to segue again, so there's love, and then probably equally as important, there's the willingness to be vulnerable. So Tracy, how do you feel like vulnerability plays a role in leadership, specifically responsibility in D&I?
You know, I talk about vulnerability a lot because, you know, to get real about this conversation around diversity and inclusion, especially in this moment in time, you have to be willing to get a little bit vulnerable about where you stand and what you understand about the conversation. You know, it's such an important point. It ties in really to authentic leadership. And this book I'm writing, I have a chapter dedicated to the vulnerability power line, because it's very powerful to be vulnerable. It's extremely powerful. Let me unpack that a little bit. Vulnerability creates connection, right? Because when we're vulnerable, we get real, you know, we break it down, what we know, what we don't know, the places where maybe we could be a little bit better with our D&I work. When we're honest as leaders, that creates a human connection. And connection drives inclusion and belonging. And we know that inclusion gets better performance, better productivity, we get the innovation, all of that is a result. So to me, authentic leadership, when we support our leaders to be vulnerable, that totally drives an inclusion conversation, that totally drives better results. I can give you a perfect example of this. Back again in my CDO days at Anthem, I used to hear all the time, and I'm sure Lisa's heard it in her different opportunities, you hear groups that are not quite satisfied with the work you're doing in a particular space. LGBTQ, we need to be standing out on this issue, that issue, blah, 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 blah. Oh, the CEO, he just does not understand. Why isn't he communicating about X, Y, or Z? Well, I would hear this quite frequently. I would hear our CEO not engaged. He's not on top of this, that, and the other. Well, we had this African-American art display in our corporate headquarters. And the CEO came, over 60 white male, came to kick that off, Black History Month. I prepped him beforehand, talked about what we were doing, gave him, you know, the talking points. You know how you get your CEO prepped. When he got there, he totally went off script. And I said, okay, this might not be so good. But what he did was powerful because he talked about his experience as a child, seeing places where it said colored only, whites only. And that never, ever left him. And that was the root for why he supported the work that we were doing, because he said he never understood it. And it bothers him to this day. And that moment where he was vulnerable created so much connection with the leaders of the African American Resource Group that it quelled a lot of their concerns about where he stood, where he was coming from. So it's not like he had the solution. He couldn't talk about walking with Martin Luther King. He didn't have anything super powerful that he could say other than this is my story. And this is how diversity hit me at a very young age. And that created connection. And so it's incredibly powerful if people are willing to be there. So we have to support our HR leaders, because I think a lot of times our HR leaders don't know how to partner with executives and help them to tap into authenticity and to bring that forward and enable them to be vulnerable. But that really has to start at the top. That was a CEO who did that. And when you're walking that kind of talk, that's the tone you can set for other leaders.
So I'll add to this, because Tracy's absolutely right. What's interesting about vulnerability, though, is all of us feel vulnerable in certain ways, somewhere, somehow.
Absolutely.
When the racial unrest was kicking off, remember in Indianapolis, ours started on May 5th with Drazon Reed, death, and then it continued to get more powerful with Mr. Floyd and others. What was really interesting is the perception. A lot of times what you have is people think they have to know everything. So if you're really smart, I work with scientists, and they were just like, they spent years working on one topic, and they would only get their kudos when they were publishing papers and doing that kind of stuff. And suddenly you're telling people to stand up and say something and draw a line in the sand on something that you haven't studied, you don't know. And then you have beliefs that you're not sure are they right or wrong. This, by the way, happened with men on the Me Too stuff, which was just a couple years ago. We had a bunch of men. I had men calling me going, "Hey, my daughter's asking me what I believe." What do I believe? And I'm like, let's talk. I don't know what. But you start finding it on the side. The other side, we had a number of Black and African Americans that were contacting my office as well, saying, I have spent most of my life, and particularly my work life, trying to not be vulnerable, trying to put the armor and the guards and doing that stuff. And now you want me to be vulnerable too? So
Yes.
All sides of vulnerability. And I think that that's a part. The counterintuitive answer, which is weird, is that everybody who had the courage to try something different. So one of my things is, if I'm avoiding something, that's probably what I probably need to do.
Amen.
When people that needed to know stuff stood up and talked to their teams with not knowing, they got love. They got, virtual hugs. They got, wow, thank you for saying it, because it was the elephant in the room and you weren't saying anything. So I was thinking you're ignorant, and I was thinking you don't care. And all of a sudden people are like, no, I just didn't know what to say. It's that, but then the same with our African Americans. They were just like, I'm practically in tears, Lisa. And if I even say something, I'm afraid I'm gonna cry. And so I'm gonna put my Zoom call on mute. I'm gonna take myself off camera, and I'm gonna cry while the meeting is going on. When team members shared that, what they were doing, it led to what Tracy's saying is that connection. And about everybody was freaking out, but in different ways, but freaking out together. And I think that's the other part, which sometimes you think, well, they have to be vulnerable. No. The weirdest thing is you have to sometimes be vulnerable first. And for men, that's harder because they're told not to be. For people of color, you're told to put on the armor, you're going to have to power through better. For majority or people that are in the dominant culture, they're told, be careful, you're going to get punished if you go too far that way. So it takes courage to go for it. It takes courage to receive it. And it just takes courage just to be vulnerably real. And then the weirdest counterintuitive thing is then people give you kudos. So Lisa, I told them I didn't know what to do. And they actually sent me amazing emails telling me how much they appreciated it. And that's never happened before, and I think that that's what's weird about this topic in and of itself. It's just counterintuitive on how it works and is working at this point in time, right? At this point in time with our technology and the social media. So I don't know, it's really interesting. That's why I say as a practitioner, it's kind of like this movie. We don't know how it's going to end, but you're still in the movie. So you have to kind of still keep going and trying things and hoping the movie will turn out the way you hope. That it's going to be a good movie, right? It could be one of those sucky movies nobody picks up,
You know, I'll give you a hack for like a very, very simple hack. And I don't know how well it'll play out over Zoom calls, but something I started doing at work when you're just passing in the hall. And I would say the same thing when you're hopping on a call and everybody's doing those initial greetings. You know, how many times have we been hopping on a call, initial greeting, or walking down the hall when we were all together and someone said, "Hey, how you doing?" You say, "I'm good," and keep going. How many times have you really been honest about where you're at? And that was a small change. A few years ago, I started doing that. Going down the hall, someone was flying by me, headed to the little break area. "Hey, Tracy, how you doing?" I said, "You know," and they had to stop and come back because they weren't listening. "You know, I am not so good today, and here's why." And then unpacking that and creating the conversation. Had a fabulous conversation. And then the next time we saw each other, it builds from there. Because a lot of this is just about everybody opening up just a little bit. Like Lisa said, it's not just executive leaders have to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
Everyone has to be willing to step into that space. And that's an easy way to get it started and begin a dialogue with folks.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, so in the interest of time, I want to give an opportunity for some Q&A. So Brad, I think you wanted to do the Q&A management.
And I don't see any questions yet, but I do have one, and maybe that will inspire some additional people. So Tracy, you were talking just a little bit ago, and Lisa was kind of sharing the same perspective about the use of data, right? And weaving data appropriately to tell a story, and a story related to try to address some kind of a business issue. And the amount of data that we're wrestling with, day in, day out in our organizations just gets increasingly greater. And one of the elements of data that we're seeing emerge these days is in the area of organizational network analysis, the ability to look how people are connected to one another through their communications, whether that's through emails, whether that's through social networks, whether that's through particular projects that they may work on together. And I guess my question to both of you would be, have you begun to look at that kind of information to help set the course for diversity and inclusion, how people are interacting with each other from a business perspective?
I haven't analyzed it in detail, but I'm aware that work is going on. And I think it gets back to some of the things that Lisa was talking about when she was saying, hey, we got the wins, and we shortly realized that we have been networking and been supported by men. So I think when you start to unpack diversity and inclusion, you do need to look at those networks, because that's going to tell you a lot about how to get the work done. So it's not just about allyship. I don't mean it just from that perspective, but when we start trying to solve some of these issues, especially issues of, say, promoting diverse talent through the organization, we're going to have to accept that we are going to rely on the majority, the dominant group, the white group, to help pull that talent up. So looking at the networks and the connections that women and minorities have through data can be extremely helpful in how do we make movement with the talent. So I think that's a really critical piece.
Brad, I know some of that. So Mercer was doing a lot of that research on internal labor maps, but they were also doing networking maps. There's ways for them to do that. I think the gap is that we don't know what we don't know in that. We don't right now, we don't really know how people connect, whether it's technologically or whatever. I think the COVID-19 has given us an insight into that, right? I mean, now figuring out that where are people working from, like even the remote spaces, are they really working from where you think they're working?
Yeah.
What's going on? We were able to do that, but I think that's the thing that I think the future of work is, quite frankly, I think it's flexible. I think how people are going to get things done. I think the younger generation, they're so technologically savvy that their ability to get work done, and it's going to look like they're in the United States and they're not, right? So right now we're focusing, at least at IU Health, we're focusing a lot of our data tied to health, health metrics, right? And thinking about how do you help population health. When I look at social determinants of health, what you can do is you can really see those networkings around zip codes. And then you start looking at where do they go? What stores do they go to? And then do those stores have vegetables, and you can see food deserts. So I think as we kind of start mapping out, honestly, ecosystems, I think we'll see a lot more of that. But I've seen it work in some organizations, excuse me, but we don't have a lot of it.
Yeah, no, and it's kind of a super emerging topic. So if you can think about looking at network analysis, and you realize that 20% of your managers have virtually no connections to the diverse population of your organization, or with women, as the case might be if you're a man, the telltale signals of that, so that you can begin to look for paths to change course on that. That was my question. So second question has come up. And the question is, I believe that people can't aspire to what they cannot see. So that said, how do we break down organizational barriers that center around the lack of exposure to senior leaders, mentors, and career support for marginalized groups? That's a question from Ron in the chat, if you want to take a peek at that. And I'll let you guys thumb wrestle over who takes this one.
Trace can do it. That's it. I'll add this piece. And so I think you design for everybody, but you pilot for those who need it the most. So mentors, and we knew that men were being mentored or developed back in the late 90s. And so we formalized that same process for women. But then you had to start thinking, an example of the mentoring was, the assumption was women wanted to be mentored by women. Some did, but what we started doing was designing the mentorship to help people achieve their career dream. So if you wanted to go work in Japan, maybe it was better that you had a mentor from Japan to help you needed to know. So I think you have to always design for the whole, because eventually you're going to have to build out for everybody anyway. But you have to acknowledge who the gaps are, and realize that sometimes if you take language, for example, some people who speak English as a second language, it would be really probably helpful for them to have a really neat mentor who can speak their language, because they're having to speak English all the time. To help them develop that, or figure out how do you maneuver through an organization when you speak multiple languages and you might not understand all the nuances of your own career. So I don't know, Tracy, your thoughts?
No, I think that's a great point. Designing for the whole, but also being very intentional about what you're trying to do to create that kind of visibility and exposure. One of the things that I remember happened in my career even, and these are just little things that I think leaders can do. When you don't have enough diversity at your table, how can we elevate and bring someone who maybe wouldn't directly report to you and set them at the table? So this happened to me in my HR career. So senior vice president of HR, executive vice president, head of HR, decided to let me and another person sit at his staff meetings so that I got exposure to the issues and things that were being discussed at his level. And that helped incredibly for my development. So he didn't create a new direct report, but he engaged me in the infrastructure that would be at his level and at his direct report team. So I think there's things that we can do intentionally, little small things that we can say, hey, okay, I'm not telling you go out and hire the next Latina, but I am saying, let's bring Lisa to the table. She's doing great work. Let's get her exposed to what the conversation is at this level, and let's start to bring her up. Also, when we're talking about talent development, I think as HR leaders, especially, we have to be able to have that very difficult conversation with our executives who are making decisions about who they put into the talent pipeline, who they see as potential successors. We have to hold their feet to the fire in terms of the opportunities, and not always ask why. Why are we putting, Brad, white male, in this program? Why are we not putting Tracy, African-American female, in this program? So, it takes a new kind of HR leader to do some of these things that we're talking about are a little counterintuitive, to be able to create that kind of visibility and exposure for diverse talent.
Super interesting. Another question, thank you for that, both of you. Another question that's come up is, how do you know when you're oversharing in the effort of building a culture of vulnerability, right? So do you hit a threshold where you can be too vulnerable, I believe?
Yes. Yeah. TMI. TMI
Right.
doesn't acknowledge that. I think this is interesting. Again, looking at D&I as a practice, we were always saying things like bring your whole self to work, right? Bring
Mhm.
to work. Well, what if your whole self, you yell at your children or you do stupid stuff at home, that kind of stuff? We start saying, bring your best authentic self to work. So I don't want to know your whole business. I don't want to know. I worked for a leader one time that was cheating on their spouse.
Mhm.
And that became a factor for me in going to another organization. I don't want to have to lie for you. I don't want to have to lie for an organization. I've got my own ethics. So I don't want to know if you're going to do stupid stuff like that. I was the only woman, and we were traveling, the men, we had separate, separate rooms, separate floors, whatever. But I would always tell the men that I'm working with, I'm like, if you do stupid stuff, you need to know this about me. I'm going to tell your partner or your spouse, because I don't lie. And if they ask me, so I think that there is stuff that people have to be aware of, and it's always in the construct of an organization. What Tracy and I are doing is doing organizational diversity and inclusion.
Mhm.
And that is always within the construct of mission, vision, values.
Exactly.
And you've got to, that's a line in the sand, right? In addition to laws and that kind of stuff. And it gets interesting as you do it globally, what is legal in one country versus what's not legal in another.
Mhm.
Still those ethical standards. So I do think it's TMI. Some stuff is TMI, and some of it I'm just like, and I think that I've stepped over the line accidentally, not on really bad stuff, but I didn't mean to share, and I overshared, and then you can feel the silence. You're like,
Oh.
then you're like, what do I do now? It's the most awkward thing ever. So I did more of that in my younger years than I do it now, but we can all make mistakes, but that's the other thing I was just going to add is just learn how to say you're sorry, and just learn.
Exactly. I think that's one thing we need more of. Sorry, because people are not perfect. The other thing I always think about, especially when it comes to leaders, and I'm trying to push them on this vulnerability topic, and where does it stop? It is about advancing a conversation. It's not about how do I unload all of my personal problems, because I've been around that where we've got leaders going through divorces and everybody in the HR department knows about the divorce and how it's going and blah, 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 blah. It is about how to further problem solving, how to further the agenda. Passing in the hall was not about, me and my husband had a big fight the night before. Passing in the hall was, how am I currently and how am I engaging in work? What mindset am I bringing to work? This is not about unpacking all of your personal problems. And so always keep in mind, and I'm not saying overthink this. You shouldn't be walking around going, well, how can I say something that's very personal that ties into the business? No, it is about being yourself, but realizing that what you're sharing is about the engagement between two coworkers and not necessarily unpacking your personal life.
So that's a super great theme and comment to kind of conclude our time together today. We're right at the top of the hour, and we want to be absolutely respectful of your time. Devin, do you have any closing, comments for us? I'm just grateful for both Lisa and Tracy for the time and the wisdom that they've been willing to share in an alternate perspective, which hopefully has resonated with a number of people who have participated today. So personally, thank you very much for committing the time to help us out. Devin, any closing comments?
No, I think this was great. Thank you guys both for participating twice now. I've got the privilege of learning a ton from you both in our time together. I think for people that are listening, I'm super encouraged that they got to hear this, because it combined perfectly the emotion and the feelings of what it takes to do D&I well, and then also the business of